Hey guys, how you going? Hope you're all doing very well. This evening I'm going to be doing yet another movie review, so hopefully you find this one interesting. This movie is a sci-fi horror film from Ireland, English language, released in the year 2019, directed by Nisa Hardiman, and this film is called Sea Fever. So Sea Fever is about a fishing trawler owned by a struggling married couple. Now, every time they go out to the ocean, they're not coming back with enough fish. So they're on the brink of losing their boat, they're on the brink of losing their crew because they're becoming very impatient with not getting paid. So the married couple say that their next job is going to be a big one. And so they're going to pay the crew handsomely, they're going to pay off the debts to the boat, and this is a promise that they intend on keeping because they've got no other alternative. And on this particular job, a young scientist is going to go along with them. Now, she's been persuaded by her boss to go out into the middle of the ocean to do some readings, and so this appears to be a straightforward job, but unfortunately when they're in the middle of nowhere with no help around, they're going to run into a grave problem that is going to have very severe consequences. And so whether or not they make it back to shore to tell the tale is something you're going to have to find out for yourself, because that's as far as I'm going with my synopsis. Now my thoughts on Sea Fever. If you are a fan of science fiction horror film, you are going to find a lot to like about Sea Fever. It is a very easy watch. It's over before you know it. It's only 80 odd minutes long, so it doesn't outstay its welcome. And so it's definitely a film that you're going to see a lot worse, but it's definitely a movie that is very competent in the production, it's competent in the acting, the script, the special effects. I thought everything worked fairly well as far as science fiction is concerned. It really understood what it is to be a science fiction horror, and it does pay homage to classic horror films such as The Thing and other movies that made you feel had a very strong psychological effect. And so they're in the middle of nowhere, and what I really liked about Sea Fever was the use of the camera in showing you how insignificant this ship was compared to the ocean. And so their help was not around. If they ran into problems, they're going to have to fend it off themselves. And so that sheer sense of isolation is what really plays on the mind, and it actually played on these characters. And I thought as though everything was actually quite realistic in the way that they reacted to certain things. And I really like the idea of being in the middle of nowhere, because you're constantly asking yourself when a movie is set on land, why don't they call the police? Why don't they just run away? But when you've got a setting in the middle of the ocean, or whether it's the middle of the desert, or when nature plays a strong role, it really cuts those avenues of escape off. And so I never questioned why these characters weren't doing something in order for self-preservation. And so if you cut those questions out, you can actually enjoy the film. It actually gives you a little bit more realism and actually gets you into the sense of panic. And so when you don't have an escape route, then ultimately you have to fight back. And when you fight back against something that's so much bigger than you, that can actually be quite scary. And so it does create a sense of horror. And so not only is it horror as to the presence that's around this ship, but the horror of the ocean as well, because it's so vast. And so there's a lot of camera angles where it actually shows you how small this ship is, this shipping vessel. And I thought that was very effective in what it was doing. And I thought the overall stakes, what was at stake, was actually quite high, in that if they didn't come back with the fish that they sorely wanted, then ultimately they're going to lose their livelihoods. And so there was a lot at play, and so I thought as though it all really worked as far as creating a strong platform. So the overall cinematography was very dreary. I actually felt as though I was on that ship, where it was very dull colouring, and so this is something that you get a lot of in British and Irish films, that they use a very grey colour palette, and I thought the grey colour palette really matched the atmosphere that was inside this fishing trawler. You could almost smell the fish coming through the screen, which is again something that I really liked. So the whole film is very competent, but unfortunately, competent is where this movie stays, because I felt as though this was a homage to classic horror films, but it was a collection of stuff you've seen before. So the movie wants to be a homage, but at the same time it doesn't know how to create its own identity. And so you have the element of what's underneath this ship, what has stopped them in the middle of nowhere, and that's something that I'd seen before. So that sense of isolation and that paranoia, again, has been played in John Carpenter's The Thing. There's other elements in this movie that I'm not going to give away that I have seen before in classic horror films. And so the whole film, yes, it's a very easy watch, but it's a watch that just doesn't really have a heart of its own, therefore doesn't have a lot of memorability. And so the overall quality as to replay value is non-existent. And so it's definitely a movie that if you didn't really see it, you're not really missing out much on it, because I felt as though there was a snippet here of a classic film, another snippet of another classic film, but when it gels together, I just felt as though it was set pieces of what has been done before, and the movie just doesn't know how to pay homage and at the same time make a movie of its own. And so I thought Dougray Scott, who's a very good British actor, He has a role that I thought was very forgettable. You've got Connie Nielsen, who's a very good Danish actress. Again, a very forgettable performance. And so everything just seems to be going through the motions without really trying anything extravagant and really taking a risk. So if you stay confined to homages of classic films, you're going to please people who like those horror films, but when you don't take risks, then unfortunately it does become very forgettable. And I will say that this movie is quite forgettable, although it is very competent in what it's doing and as far as projecting that sense of psychology. I just thought as though the story just needed a little bit more. It didn't really want to poke its neck out onto the chopping block. And so you've got to take risks these days to actually make a shadow of your own, but I just don't feel as though Sea Fever did that, and therefore it just become quite forgettable. Yeah, it is, as I said, an easy watch. It's a watch that I wasn't disappointed with, but it's just, I just forgot it very quickly. It's because it didn't really have anything of its own. So if you've watched those classic horror films that this movie is clearly influenced by, then you just don't really see a movie of its own. You just see a movie that is a fan of those previous films, but just doesn't know how to break away from the influence that it obviously has. So overall for Sea Fever, I'm going to give this one 2 stars. Now that might seem a bit harsh, but as I said, it's very well made, certainly worth the time, but it just doesn't have enough creativity and it just doesn't have an identity of its own to actually make it worthwhile. Alright guys, that's it for my review.